Good morning. So today I have the honor and privilege of interviewing a 26-year veteran from the Foreign Service who served in Seoul, Tokyo, if I'm not mistaken, Wellington, Vienna, and also Washington, D.C. So when he retired from that, he went ahead and signed up for the International Institute of Strategic Studies, which is based in London. And there he wrote 10 books on nuclear dangers. So he's a seasoned writer. And last but not least, which is dear to my heart because I love speakers on cruise ships. I don't know if any one of you saw him on a cruise ship, but if you did, you must have had a wonderful time. A speaker on a cruise ship. I don't know which line, but that's the latest gig. Having said that, we are hit with unusual times. And I always say that during unusual times, there is something positive that comes out of it. So, what positive came out of it is a book that I definitely want you to buy because it's near and dear to anybody who lives in DC and who's moving to DC or has interested in DC has to read this book. And the name of it is Spies, Bombs, and Beyond, a walking history of Washington, DC's Tenleytown. So, without further ado, there you go. Thank you, thank you. Without further ado, let me introduce you to Mark Fitzpatrick. Mark, good morning, and thank you for being here today.
Good morning, Adrian, and thanks for that very nice introduction and plugging my book. I'm really delighted that you came across it and that we can talk this morning.
Absolutely. So I'm a fan, I'm a realtor, and whenever I do open house, I like to have the history of the neighborhood. And what I have found, which is very interesting, is there are a lot of people that live in the neighborhood, have no idea, and people moving into the neighborhood, of course, don't. So you have given me an array of information for my future work. So
Great.
I would like to ask you, how did you come up with the idea for this book?
Right. So, I was lecturing on cruise ships. I would talk about the politics and the history of the various cruise ship destinations, and I did, Viking and Seabourn and Crystal and others. And then when the pandemic stopped me from traveling, I was limited to my neighborhood. So I would go on long walks every day for my exercise, and I would start looking more closely at what I was seeing and noticing there's a lot in my neighborhood and in the surrounding neighborhoods worthy of exploration. So I started exploring them, and I would write blog posts for my Facebook family and friends. And I did about 50 of them. And my friend said, you should make this into a book, Mark. And I thought, okay, I'll make it into a book. And then I added 20 more stories and I improved the others. And, when you make a book, it's got to be accurate. So I had to do a lot more research. And so I produced this book, and I was kind of pleased that I was able to do it all in the space of a year.
That's wonderful. But why Tenleytown?
Well, okay, so sorry. So I live in American University Park.
Mm-hmm.
And I go to Tenleytown. And there's no dividing line between Tenleytown and American University Park.
Mm-hmm.
But I walk a lot in Tenleytown, and there are Tenleytown Heritage Trail signs here and there, about 17 of them in Tenleytown. And that was an inspiration. And because I read the signs and I explored those sites. And so a lot of them are included in my book. But I wanted to go beyond that old history to discover more recent history and also beyond Tenleytown. So I covered Friendship Heights, Spring Valley, Wesley Heights, North Cleveland Park, all the surrounding areas. Anything that was within a half a mile walk of my house, okay. I considered my neighborhood. I walk kind of fast, so so I got around a lot. And I could have done twice as many stories as the 70 that I discussed, but I wanted to focus on stories that would appeal both to local people and outside the Washington, D.C. area. So I always tried to find some hook that connected with a national story or even an international story.
Yeah, that's what I really liked about it. As I said in my introduction, I like the fact that I can use this material for either people that don't live in DC, people that are moving into DC to get a little better sense of where they're moving into and the history of the place they're living. So After reading several of the chapters, I was curious to know which are the most prominent spy stories that you uncovered in your text.
Yeah, so there are 10 different spies who feature in my book. And
Mm-hmm.
the most prominent ones, and the ones that actually were my first posting when I started writing Facebook postings, were two British traders, members of the infamous Cambridge Five, who lived in a house just a few blocks away from me at 4100 Nebraska Avenue.
Okay.
The Kim Philby house. Kim Philby and another of the Cambridge Five, Guy Burgess, lived there in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And they spied for the Soviet Union. They passed along America's most important secrets. And it's a quite intriguing story, this Kim Philby, because he was under suspicion, but he wasn't actually nabbed for 10 or 15 years later, because the upper crust of the British society who populated the ranks of the MI5, the Secret Service,
Mm-hmm.
couldn't believe that one of their own would be a traitor. And the more working class guys who worked in MI6, the equivalent of America's FBI, were on to Philby, but they couldn't pin it on him. Anyway, when Philby came under suspicion in about 1951, he arranged for Guy Burgess to get sent back to London because he had several traffic violations in one day, and he insulted cops, and so he was kind of persona non grata, sent back to London to warn one of the other members of the Cambridge Five, Don.
Mm-hmm.
He was about to be uncovered. Then McLean and Burgess went off to the Soviet Union. Kim Philby grabbed up his spy equipment, his Russian camera, the film, and drove off to near Old Anglers Inn in Great
Mm-hmm.
Maryland, and buried the incriminating evidence somewhere in the woods there. And it's never been uncovered to date.
Wow.
Except in a novel by Daniel Silva, a recent novel called The Other Woman, which Daniel Silva creates this fictional anti-heroine, Rebecca Manning, who is supposed to be Kim Philby's daughter, and like she's a double agent. And at the end of the book, she goes out to Great Falls and finds the spy equipment, and then is confronted by an Israeli guy who's chasing her. And by the way, along the way, it really appealed to me, this spy novel, because Rebecca Manning supposedly lived on Warren Street across from the community garden.
Okay.
I live on Warren Street across from the
community garden. No wonder.
So it might have been my house that Rebecca Manning supposedly lived in.
Right. That's wonderful. Who else? What other spy story?
Two other notorious characters are Kendall and Gwen Myers, who lived at the Westchester luxury apartments and spied for Fidel Castro.
For Cuba. Mm-hmm.
Cuba. Kendall Myers was at the State Department at the same time I was. We overlapped for many years. I never met him because I was in the East Asia Bureau and he was at the Foreign Service Institute. He focused on Europe, actually. Anyway, he spied for the Cubans for many years. Why did he do that? It always intrigued me. Why did Kim Philby, why do these people, why are they traitors to their country? In the Myers case, it was this misplaced sense that Cuba was some kind of a socialist nirvana. He became disillusioned with the United States, and his wife did too, and the two of them fed off of each other. And
yeah, I think in that particular case, it's something that I read about. I think it was more of a political sentiment than a need, because many times spies basically are looking for an economic advantage. Here it was like a passion. It was like they were passionate about that, about the Castro-Rus regime and what it stood for.
Yeah, exactly. There was another Cuban spy who lived in Cleveland Park that I mentioned in the same chapter as the Myers, who similarly, she was a DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency analyst, who became enamored with Cuba's socialist paradise. I mean, I've been to Cuba, and it's not a paradise.
Exactly.
And also, Myers had a midlife crisis. That was part of it. But Just the last thing I want to say about that particular story, the kind of
Mhm.
the neighborhood interest, in addition to living in our wider neighborhood, is that he and his wife would pass secrets to their Cuban handlers in grocery stores. One of which was the Giant Food at Wisconsin.
Wisconsin Avenue, the old Giant Food.
Passing, they would be passing their grocery carts. They'd have the information in the grocery cart, and then they would exchange grocery carts.
That's interesting. That is very interesting. That I didn't know. I did know about their wheelings and dealings and the fact that they were enamored with the regime
Yeah.
more than the economic.
Yeah, they didn't get any money from it. They did it out of ideology.
Right, right. Any other one that we should know about?
Oh, well, there's a lot of interesting ones. There was Victor Perlo, who in the 1940s and 50s spied for the Soviet Union. He lived on a Brandywine Street in American University Park. He was one of the many liberal economists. He was a liberal economist. He actually was very important in Roosevelt's New Deal. Security and a lot of the other fundamental elements of our society. Victor Perlo was instrumental, but he also was a Soviet spy because he was a communist. And at the beginning, Soviet Union was an ally of the United States. So he figured, it wasn't any big deal passing military secrets to an ally, but you're not supposed to do that. Secrets are secrets. And Victor Perlo was caught, and he was dragged before the Congress, and Gene McCarthy was after him. And because Gene McCarthy, was a notorious nutcase who over way on the deep end side, the people that he persecuted,
yeah,
are sometimes given a pass because, well, if they were enemies of of McCarthy, they might be good guys. But Victor Perlo was a traitor, and Alger Hiss is another one. There's a whole group of them, and there's a lot. It's very interesting. And
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So tell me, let's move on to another subject that also is extremely interesting in this area. What's the story behind the bombs and other war material that is so closely intertwined with our neighborhoods?
Yeah, this is
and the history.
This is a kind of sad. This is a sad story, really. So the history is, when the United States entered World War I in 1917, the then president of American University offered 72 acres of his little used campus to the government for whatever purpose desired. And so the Army decided to use it to train new recruits, thousands of them, the largest training area in the Washington, D.C. area. They had barracks near my house in American University Park, and they also used it to develop and test chemical weapons. And at the end of the war, they just bulldozed over the testing grounds without much concern about what lied buried underneath.
And the interesting part there was, if I recall, it wasn't just testing grounds per se. There were trenches. There were things that were just covered.
Oh, yeah,
regardless of what was there,
pictures are fascinating to see these trenches, and then the pits where bombs were buried. So the bombs were discovered in 1993. Workers constructing new housing in Spring Valley.
Glenbrook, yeah.
Well, actually, Glenbrook came later.
Okay.
Was 52nd Court. Workers there uncovered some rusty canisters in 1993, and they were discovered to be old mustard mortars, some of which were still live, mustard gas mortars. So, so the Army Corps of Engineers, they evacuated people from 72 houses around that area and cleaned it up. And after 2 years, they decided, okay, we're done. It's all clean. Everything's taken care of. Well, not quite. A couple of one guy in particular noticed discrepancies in the report, and then on Glenbrook Road, Glenbrook Drive, people discovered in the front yard of or in the yard of the American University president's house, they uncovered some bottles that smelled really bad, and then they did some other investigation and realized that a burial pit had been in right there. the burial pit partly was in the garden of the Korean ambassador's residence.
Which unfortunately, I think it happened when the Army Corps said, yes, everything is A-OK. I think they gave the green light to W.C.N. Miller, who developed this area, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, Miller already had been developing it.
Right, and that came later, right?
And when they gave the green light, Miller Company said, well, this is the safest place ever to live because it's all been certified as clean, but it wasn't thorough enough. And I tell a story about the Korean ambassador's residence. The backyard, there were 682 old canisters and bottles and so forth, which were unearthed. A friend of mine, when he went to a reception at the Korean ambassador's residence, he presented his card. He worked in the Non-Proliferation Bureau, and so the ambassador welcomed him and said, so the food is in the courtyard, the drinks are along the patio, and the WMD, the weapons of mass destruction, are in the back garden. Yeah,
I love it. I love it. At least he had a sense of humor.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way.
And it was the property next door to that where the worst poison was discovered. And that property in between the American University President's House and Korean Ambassador's residence has been being cleaned up for these last 20 years. And it's just now finally ending. The cleanup is finally ending.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a couple of meetings for us, the realtors, next month regarding, the condition of these things, et cetera. I live on Rockwood Parkway, so I know I'm very familiar.
Yeah, it's close to you.
Yeah, it's close to me. And I have a couple of wells, one in the front and the back of my home. And those wells were checked every 3 months because a woman that worked for the Army Corps of Engineers way back in, must have been the 90s. She lived where I lived and had fallen sick. And so therefore they had, cleaned this place up and they checked the wells, et cetera, and we're A-OK, thank God. Nothing is, transpired from that.
Good.
But anyway, let's get on to something a little less negative. How about this really caught my eye because my husband is a Mozart, this is what he listens to every day. So when we both got to that part of your book, I thought I have to ask, talk to me about Mozart and the connection to Masonry.
Yeah. Okay. So disclaimer up front, Mozart never was in Tenleytown. He never was in the United
States.
Of course. But I mentioned him.
And Masonry is, clear and present in the neighborhood.
It definitely is. When I started writing my stories and I started looking at buildings more closely, I realized that on Wisconsin Avenue, across from the Tenleytown Friendship Library, nice building. It's the Masonic Temple, and so I explored it a bit, and I realized that in the early part of the 20th century, Masonry was really important to the Tenleytown area, the neighborhood. It was, I would say, the second most important institution in the neighborhood after the churches. And I knew that from my diplomatic career. I lived in Austria for 4 years, and where I became a Mozart fan, my wife in particular, and we learned that that Mozart was an important member of the Masons, and he included Masonry imagery in his work. Most importantly, in the Magic Flute opera. It's a beautiful, marvelous.
It is.
It's a little confusing. It's been called an Enlightenment allegory veiled by Masonic symbols. Just I forgot to say that in the 18th, 19th centuries, Masonry was really important in the Enlightenment of the Western society, in bringing society around to the view that belief should be based not on superstition or faith, but on reason and science.
And science, yes.
An issue we're still struggling with today, by the way.
Right, exactly. Well, yeah, when I got to that point, I'm going like, this sounds familiar.
Yeah, a lot of things sound familiar. So anyway, so Mozart was an important Mason, and this magic flute described a lot of Masonic themes. And halfway through the opera, the plot changes in a confusing way. And the reason, according to the musicologist teacher that we had in Vienna, is that Mozart and librettist Emanuel Schinkenader realized that they mustn't disclose the secrets of Masonry. So they changed the plot so as not to give away the plot of Masonry.
Right. That's,
so
that's a little bit, I so appreciate the story, but that is also, that's what surrounds Masonry, the secrecy.
Yeah,
and it's a pity. And it's a pity because I think that, it is an organization that has specific rules, but also that has a very charitable objective.
Yes.
And I think that sometimes that secrecy, and there are a number of Mason temples around Washington, D.C. You never see anybody there. They're concrete. They look somber sometimes, but yet there's a lot of positive behind that.
There's a lot of positive, and I think it's unfortunate that the Freemasonry has fell into decline. The Masonic temple on Wisconsin Avenue now is the home for I think 4 or 5 lodges. They've had to combine because of shrinking membership.
Even though I've seen a pickup, I have several. I've seen a pickup. I have several colleagues whose husbands have become Freemasons, and I'm talking in the last 2 or 3 years. So interesting.
Good.
Okay, so moving on, I wanted to know which are the most prominent accounts of diplomatic intrigue that you unveiled in your walking research.
Yeah, so I think probably the most intriguing is the case of Jonathan Pollard, who it was in the news recently, and I'll get to that. So about 1.5 miles east of my house, within my 30-minute walk, is the International Chancery Center, which was formerly the grounds of the National Standards Bureau.
Right.
And the U.S. government in the 1970s allocated it for diplomatic missions to build embassies. And Israel was the first country to take advantage of that and built their embassy basically on the corner of Reno and Van Ness.
What we know as not Embassy Row, but it's international, the international.
It's called the International Chancery Center.
Chancery Center.
Yeah, 17 embassies are there, and my book has pictures of all of them. So this Israel embassy is sometimes the site of protests by Palestinians and so forth. And I think Israel. I really admire Israel. They allow protests. It's part of the democratic process. It was also the site one time of a diplomatic spy chase, a thrilling spy chase. Jonathan Pollard was under suspicion. Well, he was being tailed by the FBI and by the Naval Investigative Service because they had evidence that he was passing secrets to the Israelis. And yeah, he passed a lot of secrets. It all came out. He was meeting with them for a year, passing briefcases of secret documents to his Israeli.
What was Jonathan Pollard's profession?
He was an analyst with the Naval Intelligence Service.
Okay.
He was an analyst. So he had access to intelligence information. So when he realized, he and his wife were in their car, they realized they were being tailed by the feds. They decided to make a break for it and try to claim asylum at the Israeli embassy. So they drove up to the gate of the Israeli embassy and they said, let us in, we want asylum. And the guards wouldn't let them in. And then the feds came a minute or two later and arrested Jonathan Pollard and his wife. And then Pollard, after 2 years of investigation and a trial, was sentenced to life imprisonment. And it became a cause célèbre in Israel. Prime ministers and political leaders in Israel would always be trying to persuade the US president to let Jonathan Pollard go. But the US intelligence community was dead set against it because the secrets he passed along, more than what was known publicly, were so detrimental to US national security that he needed to pay a penalty of life imprisonment for that.
And I also feel there was a good example of what not to do.
Yeah, I mean, I had to take an oath when I was a diplomat, and yeah,
Hmm.
passing secrets. I can't get it into my head. And Pollard, okay, he was a fervent Jew, but fervent Jews don't spy for another country. And he also tried to pass his secrets to 4 other countries, so he wasn't doing it just for ideological affiliation with Israel. So the denouement of the story is that in 2015,
Hmm.
Jonathan Pollard was released on parole for 5 years. The parole period came up in November last year, and so he went to Israel. He was free to go to Israel. He went there, a hero's welcome, and that's the end of the story.
That's amazing. It
Yeah,
is
yeah,
amazing that he, I understand, spying is it's just, it's par for the course. Every country does it, unfortunately, to the detriment of the country that they're spying on. But amazing
yeah,
that he would get. I heard that I read about, so I was surprised. I didn't know the whole story.
yeah.
So this is great.
Thank
So
you.
this is what I would like to do. If you agree, Mark, we have a second session, and I'd like everybody to know. And in our next session, we will be talking about specific properties, choice properties that Mark wrote about, just to give us a little dangling carrot more about his book. But I want to recall that his book is Spies, Bombs, and Beyond, A Walking History of Washington, D.C.'s Tenleytown. Thank you, Mark. I think it is a must read. It is very accessible, has a bunch of information, which is very, very fruitful, but it's not a complex book. So if you want a good read, definitely
And
please
it's
go ahead and do
available
that.
as an ebook on Amazon for a giveaway price of $3.99.
Absolutely, that's what I got. I went online, said Amazon, Kindle, and then here it is. So I definitely would recommend it. Mark Fitzpatrick, it has been a privilege and a pleasure to have you on today and have this conversation. Mark Fitzpatrick information will appear at the bottom of this interview. If you want to contact him, his email will be there. Please ask questions. It is well worth it. Read his book, and I'm sure he would enjoy the contact from all of you. Mark, I will see you next time, and thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome. And thank you very much, Adrian.